Washington, D.C., 1959. On a government desk sit several jars of one of the most ordinary foods in America, peanut butter. The labels promise something simple, but federal regulators have found a problem inside some of those jars. Manufacturers have been reducing the amount of peanuts and making up part of the difference with cheaper oils and other ingredients. The Food and Drug Administration proposes a line. If a company wants to call its product peanut butter, at least 95% of it should be peanuts. The manufacturers push back. Only a few percentage points separate the two sides. Yet the disagreement grows into a regulatory battle involving some of the biggest names in the business: Skippy, Jif, Peter Pan. The hearings will stretch for roughly 20 weeks. The testimony will approach 8,000 pages, all to settle a question that sounds almost ridiculous. How much peanut has to be in peanut butter before it stops being peanut butter? The answer had become surprisingly difficult because by 1959, peanut butter was no longer simply ground peanuts. Decades of inventors, doctors, farmers, engineers, wars, economic crises, and food chemistry had changed what Americans expected to find when they opened a jar, and the man most Americans associate with inventing peanut butter had not invented it at all. Before we go back to where this story really begins, tell me where you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering the hidden history behind familiar foods, give the video a like and subscribe, because this story begins far earlier and in a much stranger place than the modern jar suggests. Go back 75 years before that fight in Washington, not to George Washington Carver, not even to the United States. In 1884, a Canadian named Marcellus Edson received an American patent for a process involving roasted peanuts. Edson lived in Montreal, and the problem he was working on was surprisingly mechanical. Grind roasted peanuts under the right conditions, and something interesting happens. The nuts release their oil. Their structure breaks down. What begins as a dry solid can turn into a thick, oily paste. Edson's process used heated grinding surfaces to help produce a fluid or semi-fluid mass. Once cooled, he wrote, the material took on a consistency resembling butter, lard, or ointment. Not exactly the language a modern advertising agency would choose, but the patent matters for what it proves. More than 30 years before George Washington Carver published his famous work on peanuts, someone had already documented a recognizable method for producing a butter-like peanut paste. Edson was not creating the exact product sitting in supermarkets today. His patent was closely connected to confectionery. He even described combining the paste with a large amount of sugar. Still, one piece of the puzzle was in place. Peanuts could be deliberately transformed into a smooth, concentrated food, which leaves an obvious problem with the familiar invention story. If someone could make peanut paste in 1884, why didn't America immediately start eating peanut butter? Because inventing a substance and creating a food culture around it are two very different things. The peanut itself was already ancient. Long before jars, factories, sandwiches, or American lunchboxes, peanuts had been domesticated in South America. Modern genetic research traces the cultivated crop to wild ancestors from that region, and people were growing peanuts long before Europeans reached the Americas. After the 16th century, maritime trade helped carry the crop far beyond its original home. Peanuts entered new climates, agricultural systems, and cuisines. But a crop can circle the world without becoming a major industry. In North America, peanuts remained commercially limited for generations. They existed. People ate them. Farmers grew them. What did not yet exist was a national reason to turn them into butter. Edson had a process. What he lacked was a mass market. That market began to emerge in a place almost no one would associate with a children's sandwich: a sanitarium. In Battle Creek, Michigan, John Harvey Kellogg was building an entire philosophy around food, health, digestion, and vegetarianism. Today, The Kellogg name immediately suggests breakfast cereal. In the 1890s, John Harvey Kellogg's concerns were much broader. Patients at the Battle Creek Sanitarium needed foods that delivered nutrition without being difficult to eat. Some had trouble chewing solid foods. Kellogg was also a committed advocate of diets that reduced or eliminated meat. Nuts offered an unusual solution. They were calorie-dense and rich in nutrients, but in their natural form, they were not ideal for someone with weak or missing teeth. Grinding changed that. Kellogg experimented with preparing and grinding edible nuts, including peanuts, into soft foods that patients could consume more easily. Some of those preparations would seem strange beside a modern jar. Kellogg's patented processes could involve cooking or boiling nuts before grinding them. This was not the roasted, sweetened spread generations of Americans would come to recognize. It belonged to another world. Nut butter entered American life partly as food for people who could not comfortably chew solid food, and partly as a vegetarian alternative to meat. That gives peanut butter one of the great reversals in American food history. The food that would eventually become shorthand for a quick children's lunch first gained traction in the world of health reform, specialized diets, and institutional medicine. And for a while, that gave it a purpose. A soft nut paste could solve a real problem. But creating a useful food for a sanitarium patient was not the same as creating a product for an entire country. The next obstacle was scale. Preparing nut butter in small batches was slow. If the product was going to move beyond places like Battle Creek, someone had to make it faster, cheaper, and more consistent. That meant machines. Joseph Lambert had worked within Kellogg's orbit and became associated with equipment for roasting and grinding nuts commercially. Then, in 1903, another inventor, Ambrose W. Straub, received a patent with a title that left little room for ambiguity: Mill for grinding peanuts for butter. By then, the challenge had shifted. No one needed to prove that peanuts could become paste. The question was whether that paste could be manufactured efficiently enough to become a business. Food history often turns on machinery for exactly this reason. A recipe tells you what can be made. A machine determines who can afford it. A hand grinder can produce a bowl, a purpose-built mill can supply customers, and as peanut butter moved into machinery, the economics surrounding the peanut began to change with it. American peanut production was becoming more valuable. Between 1899 and 1909, the reported commercial value of the U.S. crop more than doubled. Processors could grind more peanuts. Nut butters were appearing beyond medical institutions. But a larger industry creates a larger appetite for raw material. More peanut butter required more peanuts, produced cheaply and reliably. And that demand was about to intersect with a crisis tearing through Southern agriculture. For generations, cotton had dominated huge areas of the American South. It generated wealth, but dependence on cotton came at a cost. Repeated cultivation depleted soils. Farmers became tied to an agricultural system in which the success or failure of one crop could determine whether a family made it through the year. Then another threat arrived: the boll weevil. As the insect spread across cotton-growing regions, damaged fields exposed just how vulnerable the system had become. Farmers needed alternatives. Peanuts were one of them, and this is where George Washington Carver enters the story. Not as the inventor of peanut butter, as a man facing a much harder problem. By the time Carver's famous Peanut Bulletin appeared in 1916 and 1917, Edson's peanut paste patent was already more than 3 decades old. Kellogg had been developing nut preparations in the 1890s. Lambert and Straub had helped push production towards specialized machinery. Carver was working on something else. At Tuskegee, he looked at poor Southern farmers, exhausted soil, cotton dependence, and a rural economy that gave many families almost no margin for failure. Crop diversification offered a way out of that trap. Peanuts, sweet potatoes, cowpeas, and other crops could reduce dependence on cotton. Legumes such as peanuts could fit into rotations intended to improve depleted soil, while also producing something farmers could eat or sell. Carver tried to make those alternatives practical. His agricultural bulletins were not written for wealthy industrialists operating modern factories. Tuskegee's outreach emphasized methods ordinary farmers with limited equipment and limited money could actually use. His famous peanut bulletin presented 105 ways of preparing peanuts for human consumption. That number became part of the legend. Over time, Carver became so closely associated with peanuts that the public story simplified itself. George Washington Carver invented peanut butter. He didn't. And correcting that myth doesn't diminish him. It reveals the scale of the problem he was actually trying to solve. What could a farmer plant when cotton was failing? How could exhausted soil recover? How could a family produce something it could eat and still have a crop worth selling? Peanuts offered part of the answer, but only part. A farmer can grow a new crop. That doesn't mean anyone wants to buy it. Agricultural authorities warned that farmers should not assume peanuts would automatically provide a profitable market everywhere. In parts of the Cotton Belt, commercial markets were still poorly developed. Farmers needed buyers, processing facilities, transportation, and reliable demand. That was the hidden weakness in diversification. A replacement crop only works if someone pays for it. Produce too little, and industry has no reason to build around the crop. Produce too much without enough buyers, and prices can collapse. So even as researchers and agricultural reformers encouraged farmers to broaden what they planted, the peanut still needed something agriculture alone could not create: demand. Then war changed the equation. During World War I, the United States encouraged conservation of foods including meat. Peanuts suddenly fit a national need. They could provide substantial nutrition without relying on livestock, reinforcing an idea health reformers had already promoted years earlier. Peanuts and peanut products could serve as alternatives to meat in some meals. Now several historical forces began moving toward one another. Farmers had reason to diversify. Peanut production was expanding. Machinery could grind the crop more efficiently, and wartime conservation gave more Americans a reason to consume it. For the first time, the conditions for a genuine mass market were starting to align. And just when peanut butter seemed ready to become a modern national food, the product revealed a flaw no farmer, mill, or wartime campaign could fix. Leave freshly ground peanut butter sitting in a jar and watch what happens. The oil rises, the heavier solids settle, the smooth paste slowly divides into layers. At home, that means stirring. For a national manufacturer, it means trouble. Picture a customer walking into a grocery store and seeing a pool of oil floating on top of a jar. The product may still be edible, but it doesn't look dependable. Its texture changes. It has to be mixed again. And over time, exposed fats can contribute to rancidity. Early sellers could find themselves stirring large containers simply to restore a uniform consistency. Peanut butter had conquered the grinder. It had not conquered gravity. And the man who attacked that problem may have done more to create the modern jar than almost anyone remembers. Joseph L. Rosefield. Rosefield approached peanut butter as a physical system. The problem wasn't how to crush peanuts. That had already been solved. The problem was that peanut solids and peanut oil did not naturally remain in the smooth, stable arrangement consumers preferred. During the early 1920s, Rosefield developed and patented methods intended to reduce that separation. By changing the fat structure of the product, so more of the fat remained solid or semi-solid at ordinary temperatures, manufacturers could keep the mixture homogeneous much longer. It was a technical adjustment with enormous commercial consequences. A grocer no longer faced the same need to keep stirring. A customer could open a jar and expect the top to resemble the bottom. The peanut butter could travel farther. It could sit longer. Its texture became more predictable. That opened the door to something early peanut paste makers had never possessed: a product capable of behaving consistently across a national distribution system. Rosefield's work also addressed complaints about texture and the tendency of peanut butter to stick heavily to the roof of the mouth. He would later market Skippy and continue refining the product. This may be the most revealing twist in the entire history. The man popularly remembered as peanut butter's inventor did not invent it. The man behind one of its earliest patents did not create the exact product we recognize today. And one of the people who helped solve the problem that made modern supermarket peanut butter possible remains largely unknown outside food history. Rosefield didn't need to invent peanut paste. He made it practical. Once peanut butter could remain stable during storage and distribution, manufacturers could think nationally. Once one jar could reliably resemble the next, brands could sell consistency rather than merely food. And once consumers became accustomed to that smooth consistency, they stopped thinking of it as a technological achievement. They began thinking of it as what peanut butter was supposed to be. If you enjoy stories where the familiar version of history turns out to be only half the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because solving the jar was only the beginning. The next transformation would happen when peanut butter met another piece of industrial food technology that Americans now barely notice. Sliced bread. Peanut butter sandwiches already existed. So did combinations of peanut butter and fruit preserves. In 1901, Julia Davis Chandler published what is generally regarded as the earliest widely documented recipe for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It would look surprisingly refined next to the lunchbox version that came later. Thin bread, peanut paste, currant or crab apple jelly, closer to a delicate finger sandwich than a cheap school lunch. The combination had been discovered. What did not yet exist was the economic system that would turn it into a habit. For that, several unrelated developments had to converge. Peanut butter had to become stable. Bread had to become more convenient. The ingredients had to become affordable. And eventually, hardship would turn convenience from a novelty into an advantage families could not ignore. By the late 1920s, commercially sliced bread made sandwich preparation almost effortless. No knife sawing through a loaf. No thick piece followed by a thin one. Open the package. Take 2 slices. Spread. Close. A stabilized jar of peanut butter and a factory-sliced loaf belonged to the same emerging food culture. Both reduced labor. Both delivered consistency. Both saved time. Then came the Great Depression, and suddenly those qualities meant more than convenience. For families watching every dollar, peanut butter had a useful combination of traits. It was filling. It stored easily. It required almost no preparation. It could turn inexpensive bread into a substantial meal. The product that had once occupied the world of sanitarium patients and specialized vegetarian diets was becoming an everyday food. Not because Americans had suddenly developed a fascination with peanut paste. Because its economics now made sense. Cheap enough to matter. Simple enough to prepare. Reliable enough to keep in the kitchen. Jelly made the combination even easier to love. Peanut butter could be thick and sticky. Fruit preserves added sweetness and moisture. Together, the ingredients solved each other's weaknesses. The sandwich required no stove, no complicated recipe, and almost no time. And yet a practical food does not automatically become a cultural symbol. World War II pushed the combination into another setting where convenience carried unusual value. American military food systems made peanut butter and fruit spreads available to servicemen. When those components were combined into sandwiches, they produced something portable, calorie-dense, and easy to assemble. That mattered in a system built around logistics. No elaborate preparation. No special skill. Very little equipment. Bread. Peanut butter. Jelly. It was less a culinary breakthrough than a perfect piece of practical engineering. And practical foods have a habit of following people home. Millions of Americans returned from military service to civilian life. The same kind of sandwich that made sense in a military food system fit effortlessly into the kitchens of a country that increasingly valued convenience. A child could carry it to school. A worker could pack it for lunch. A parent could make several in minutes. By the middle of the 20th century, peanut butter had crossed an extraordinary social distance. It had begun as an experimental paste, then a specialized health food. Machines turned it into an industrial product. Southern agricultural crisis gave peanuts a new economic role. War expanded demand. Food technology stabilized the jar. Sliced bread simplified the sandwich. Depression-era economics rewarded cheap calories. Military practicality reinforced the PB&J combination. And somewhere along that journey, Americans stopped seeing peanut butter as an unusual manufactured food. It became normal. That success created the conflict waiting for us back in Washington. Because once consumers considered peanut butter ordinary, they also developed very specific expectations about it. They wanted it smooth. They wanted it easy to spread. Many wanted it slightly sweet. They did not want a puddle of oil sitting on the surface. They wanted the first spoonful from a jar to behave like the last. Manufacturers had spent decades learning how to deliver that experience. But each improvement created a little more distance between commercially manufactured peanut butter and the simplest possible version of the food: roasted peanuts ground into paste. By 1959, federal regulators were examining that distance. The FDA found that some products sold as peanut butter had reduced their peanut content substantially through the use of cheaper oils and other ingredients. The agency proposed a standard. If the label said peanut butter, at least 95% of the product should be peanuts. From the government side, the logic was straightforward. A consumer buying peanut butter should receive something overwhelmingly made from peanuts. Manufacturers saw another side of the problem. Consumers weren't buying an abstract definition. They were buying texture, flavor, spreadability, stability. The qualities industry had spent decades teaching them to expect. Additional ingredients helped manufacturers achieve those qualities. They could also help control costs. Suddenly, 5 percentage points represented far more than 5 percentage points. They represented flexibility in formulation, manufacturing economics, and the question of how closely a modern processed food had to resemble its simplest ancestral form. So the companies fought. Skippy, Jif, Peter Pan, and other commercial interests became part of a dispute that turned an everyday sandwich spread into a test case for American food regulation. The FDA initially proposed a standard centered on 95% peanuts. Manufacturers objected. The agency moved toward 90%. The argument continued. The resulting hearing lasted roughly 20 weeks. Scientists, attorneys, regulators, and industry representatives generated nearly 8,000 pages of testimony over what could legally be sold under two words most consumers had never thought needed defining: peanut butter. Seen without context, the whole episode borders on comedy. Nearly 8,000 pages, over a sandwich spread. But the argument only looks trivial if you ignore the previous 75 years. Edson's paste didn't have to survive national distribution. Kellogg's nut foods were intended for a specialized nutritional environment. Early sellers could tolerate separation because industrial consistency was not yet a universal expectation. Rosefield helped change that. Mass manufacturing changed it further. Depression-era households valued economy. Wartime systems valued portability. Post-war consumers increasingly valued convenience. Brands competed on texture, taste, sweetness, and shelf stability. By 1959, peanut butter was no longer merely something made from peanuts. It was a bundle of expectations. The government now had to decide how much manufacturers could alter the formula while still using the old name. The standard that ultimately emerged required peanut butter to contain at least 90% peanuts. After thousands of years of peanut cultivation, decades of patents, machinery, agricultural change, war, and industrial processing, peanut butter had acquired something Marcellus Edson could never have needed in 1884: a legal identity. And that brings us back to the mistake people often make when they tell the history of familiar foods. We want a beginning, a date, an inventor. Someone has an idea, the product appears, people like it, the rest seems inevitable. Peanut butter refuses to cooperate with that kind of story. Remove Edson, and one of the earliest documented technological steps disappears. Remove Kellogg, and nut butter loses an early American health food market. Remove specialized grinding machinery, and production remains slower and more expensive. Remove the Southern push toward crop diversification, and the agricultural story changes. Remove George Washington Carver, and you lose one of the most visible advocates connecting peanuts to soil, farming, and practical new uses. Remove wartime demand, and the market grows differently. Remove Rosefield's stabilization work, and the dependable national jar becomes much harder to achieve. Remove sliced bread, and PB&J loses part of what made it so convenient. Remove economic depression and wartime logistics, and the sandwich follows a different cultural path. And without regulation, even the meaning of the words on the label remains open to negotiation. That is why the George Washington Carver myth tells us something larger than simply who did or didn't invent peanut butter. People prefer history with one hero. A single name gives an object a clean origin. Carver became that name because his public reputation became inseparable from the peanut. But reducing him to the inventor of peanut butter actually makes his story smaller. His work was about soil, farmers, crop dependence, poverty, finding practical options for people with very few. The peanut was part of that work, not the whole of it. And peanut butter itself is similar. Calling it ground peanuts makes the product sound obvious. It wasn't. Someone had to figure out how to produce a useful paste. Someone had to find a market for it. Engineers had to make enough of it. Farmers had to supply the raw material. Consumers had to develop a reason to buy it. Food technologists had to stop the oil from rising. Economic hardship had to make convenience attractive. War had to reward portability. Manufacturers had to turn consistency into an expectation. And then regulators had to decide how much change the product could absorb before it became something else. Now open a modern jar. The surface is level. The texture is familiar. The knife moves through it easily. Nothing in that moment suggests a damaged cotton field. Nothing suggests a Victorian sanitarium. Nothing suggests a Montreal patent describing a paste with the consistency of ointment. Nothing suggests a food technologist trying to defeat the natural separation of peanut oil. Nothing suggests farmers wondering whether anyone would buy the new crop they had been encouraged to plant. Nothing suggests soldiers combining practical foods during wartime, and nothing suggests 20 weeks of federal hearings over whether a few percentage points could change the legal identity of an American staple. That invisibility may be the product's greatest achievement. Successful technologies eventually stop looking like technology. Their problems disappear from view. The grinding disappears. The machinery disappears. The agricultural risk disappears. The chemistry disappears. The regulation disappears. What remains is the jar, a knife, 2 slices of bread, maybe some jelly, an ordinary lunch carrying the fingerprints of people who never met one another, solving problems they often did not realize were connected. Peanut butter was never invented in one clean moment. It was reinvented each time someone discovered another reason it could fail. Too difficult to chew, too difficult to manufacture, not enough demand, too much dependence on cotton, no reliable market, oil rising to the top, a sandwich too inconvenient to make at scale, a formula drifting farther from the ingredient named on the label. One problem created the next solution, and each solution changed what consumers expected from the food. until eventually, nearly all of that effort vanished from sight. America stopped seeing the inventions. It stopped seeing the agricultural gamble. It stopped seeing the chemistry. It simply saw peanut butter.